Good afternoon. I'm Pam Strickland. I'm the founder of North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking, and I am delighted that you have decided to join us. I'm especially delighted to welcome our guest panelist here this afternoon. I also want to let you know that Melinda Sampson is on with us. She is our community outreach coordinator here at NC Stop Human Trafficking, and she's going to be helping us out during the panel, kind of behind the scenes today. But I wanted you to know that she is here. I'm excited for you to meet the 3 stars of our new documentary that's going to be released next week. The documentary is called Human Trafficking in North Carolina and was produced in partnership with UNC Greensboro and was funded by the Governor's Crime Commission. I hope that you will register to view the screening, which is 1 week from today exactly. And I'm asking Melinda if she will please to put that link in the comments so that you all can register if you'd like. I'm going to run through the format very quickly just so you'll know what the plan is for today. First, I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to introduce themselves to you. And then I have a few questions that I'm going to ask each one of them to answer. Audience members, you will be able to type in questions in the comments. And if we have some time at the end, we'll ask our panelists to answer some of those. Thank you again for joining us. And we are going to jump right in. So I am going to ask Kiricka to start by telling us about herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Pam. My name is Kiricka Yarbough Smith. I am the Director for Human Trafficking Programs at the North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement Office under the Department of Administration. I've been doing human trafficking work in North Carolina for about 18 or 19 years and have worked really closely with Pam and Caitlyn for a very long time. And so I'm just happy to be here and really get more involved with more with this film and the documentary, and hoping that it really helps people understand what's happening in North Carolina around human trafficking.
Thank you so much, Kiricka. And I am going to
Pam, I didn't hear you.
So you just quit.
We're having a bit of some technical difficulties with the Zoom right now. Pam will be on in just a second. I'm gonna really pitch here. Thanks so much for your patience. And as she logs on, would you please introduce yourself, Vicki?
Okay, I'm Vicki Dalia with Safe Homes Anti-Child Trafficking. Although I've been educated to work in this field, I have a sociology degree from North Carolina State. I've worked in the field of child abuse my whole adulthood. I have a large family. I have 10 biological children to the husband I've been married to for 47 years. And I have 8 adopted children. So I have children from age 55 down to age 16. I have been involved in human trafficking. I'm a survivor. My father started grooming me at age 3. I'm very passionate about getting the word out about familial trafficking because I think those are the kids that are being discovered the least and need the help the most. My husband and I have written a book on my experiences as a trafficked child called The Long Shadows of Darkness and how it has affected our family. And I have PTSD, and because I was filmed in child pornography, I hate having cameras look at me. So if I look weird, that's part of it.
Thank you, Vicki. I appreciate that. And now you see I'm at Melinda's computer, so we did have some technical problems there. But thank you all for introducing yourselves briefly and letting us get to know you a little bit. So the first thing that I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm going to ask Caitlyn to go first, is when did you learn about the issue of human trafficking? Under what circumstances did you find out about this topic?
Thanks, Pam. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Caitlyn Ryland, and I work with Legal Aid of North Carolina. We provide statewide civil legal services free of charge in all 100 counties of North Carolina. So we provide a variety of free legal services in our many offices across the state. But just specifically with regards to human trafficking, we've provided services like public benefits denial appeals, protective orders, custody related to the trafficking. We've assisted immigrant survivors of trafficking. That might be a T visa or a U visa, adjustments of status, law enforcement accompaniment to report, requests for continued presence. We've assisted victims to assert their rights under federal and North Carolina victims' rights laws. They're called victims' rights laws and not survivors' rights laws. We're going to try to use the survivor language today. Our office has filed the only federal civil lawsuits in North Carolina with TVPRA claims on behalf of survivors. So my office is located in Raleigh, but I personally work in the farm worker unit here at Legal Aid. I'm a managing attorney of that unit, and my unit offers services to migrant and seasonal farm workers statewide. You asked, when did I learn about the issue of human trafficking? Well, when I was in law school on a public interest scholarship in Mexico, working for an organization called the Center for Migrant Rights, I learned about the work of Legal Aid of North Carolina, who was assisting a group of Thai nationals who had been trafficked for forced labor by their employer through the H-2A temporary agricultural program. Legal Aid of North Carolina's farm worker unit was really doing cutting edge legal representation, a really brave group of clients at that time. And it was, if you're ever interested in more backgrounds, I encourage you to read a really great New York Times article called Low Pay and Broken Promises Greet Guest Workers by Stephen Greenhouse, which summarizes it. And that inspired me to apply to work at Legal Aid. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlyn. That was quite a famous case. And so that was your first introduction to human trafficking. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to ask Vicki now to share with us how she first learned about the issue, understanding, of course, that, as a child, Vicki, you were a victim and, of course, now a survivor. But, when did you learn that human trafficking was a thing and under what circumstances?
Well, I think in around 2000, the word human trafficking started being thrown out there. We've had the word child abuse, child sexual abuse, child exploitation. We've had all those words around for a while, but I think human trafficking first started getting out there. I'm 72 and I started my therapy. Oh my gosh, I can't even remember, sometime in my 30s. And it started out as abuse therapy, and then it became multiple perpetrator therapy. And then eventually, as the human trafficking word started getting thrown around and the money part of it started being out there, I started looking at my memories and going, oh yeah, this guy stood by the door and collected money before they gang raped us little babies. And, I started being aware of that kind of thing. My father started grooming me when I was 3. And by age 6, he was taking me to meetings where I was being gang raped. And so basically that's when I started looking at it, started thinking about it, started trying to look at what how I could be effective in this movement of trying to stop it being so easy for children and their families to be sold. Okay, there you go, Pam.
Thank you, Vicki. And I just want to say a special thank you to you for sharing these personal experiences in such a public way, so that, just because education, as you said, is so important to you. And we're really grateful for your courage and your transparency and your vulnerability in doing that. So thank you.
Thanks. You're going to make me cry.
And I'm going to ask for Kiricka now to tell us, when did you first learn about human trafficking?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. So I first learned about human trafficking actually as an intern. So I actually interned many years ago at the Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And so I was actually paired with the rape prevention education coordinator at the time. And she was the person who was not only bilingual, she worked with farm workers' rights a lot. And so she had a lot of projects related to working with immigrants and refugees as well. And so one of the things that she was tasked with was writing the first human trafficking grant that North Carolina ever received. So for me, I went to the coalition because I really, truly valued, the work that they did around sexual assault and sexual violence and really wanting to be a part of that. But then I was kind of introduced to that because I also ended up helping write that first grant and then working on that in North Carolina. And so one of the first things that I did to learn about human trafficking, actually it was a conference that I first met you at, Pam, and it was the Freedom Network came to North Carolina. And they did a training specifically talking about what human trafficking looks like, services that are being provided, things that trafficking survivors needed. And from there, I understood the connection to all of my work previously in mental health and how a lot of survivors that I had worked with in mental health may have had similar experiences.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. So we've got some real trailblazers with us here on this call. We've got Caitlyn, who was somehow involved with like the first case that was ever brought for labor trafficking in North Carolina. Kiricka with the first grant for human trafficking in North Carolina. And Vicki for bringing to light familial child sex trafficking, which is for some people still a fairly new topic. So thank y'all for being the trailblazing women that you are. So now I want to talk a little more specifically about North Carolina and what human trafficking looks like in our state, in your experience. You can talk about, the industries that are involved, the types of people who might be involved, but what does human trafficking look like in your experience? So Vicki, I'm going to start with you this time.
Okay. So my passion lies with familial trafficking. So I'm going to stick to those examples. I think one of the most profound examples that we've all had and had it, outlined for us in trainings and everything else is the Shania Davis event, murder. And I think y'all know, but I'll briefly go over it. Shania Davis was a 5-year-old biracial little girl who lived with her mother in a poverty type housing situation. Her mother had borrowed money from a man for drugs, or she made it sound better, like I needed it to pay rent. But she had borrowed money, and when the man came around to collect that money, she didn't have it, so she gave him Shania. And he wanted her for sex. He took her to the Comfort Inn. Sometime in the sexual encounter, Shania died. And he took her out and I think just threw her on the side of the road somewhere. She was eventually found. He was eventually accused. He was tried. Shania Davis's mother said all I wanted him to do was have sex with her, not kill her. But Shania Davis, I think, is a good example of the children in our areas, especially in some of our poverty areas where there's a lot of drug usage, and they're going to use those kids to help make the money to get the drugs that keep them going. I had a personal experience with it on my mountain that I don't live on anymore, but I have an Airbnb that I rent out up there, where when we were living there, I was taking my kids down off the mountain to the bus. It's a very narrow dirt road. The state doesn't maintain it. It's unmaintained. And I came up against this truck, like a rainy 7 o'clock in the mornings, and kind of slowed down and said, "Hey, what you doing on the mountain?" Because we have a lot of meth people come up on the mountain. And he said, "It's a free mountain. I can go wherever I want." And about that time, two girls, looked like they were about 14 and 15, peeked their heads up over the back of the truck, and they had terrified looks in their eyes. And he went on past, he took them up to a house on top of the mountain that we knew was being used for drug usage. And I'm sure they traded him sex for drugs. I don't know whether the drugs were for them, although they looked pretty drugged out, or for their parents. And I went down and got my kids on the bus and called the sheriff's department, which took an hour for them to get out there. And so the guy had already taken off by then. Then a friend of mine up there, she had just gotten a foster child. She's a friend of my daughter's, and she had just taken a foster child, a 3-year-old little girl. And so I saw Melinda. She was with my daughter one day, and I said, "So how's your little 3-year-old doing?" And Melinda said, "She tells me the strangest stories." And I said, "Like what?" And she says she keeps talking about a dog hurting her bum. And she goes on and on about it, and she's scared of dogs. And I said, "Melinda, she may have experienced bestiality, which is pretty common nowadays in the kiddie porn things where they match up little ones with animals." It was something I experienced as a child, and so it wasn't that bizarre to me. When I called up the caseworker, Melinda gave me the phone number for her caseworker and said, "You guys probably ought to be looking into this to see whether there's any kiddie porn gangs in the area. That bestiality is very common in those groups." And the response I got was, "Well, I'm more concerned with the breach of confidentiality than I am with anything else going on." And she could not get off that particular statement, would not help me, would not investigate any further, and just basically toss the whole thing out. And let's see. Then I talked to a woman that works in trafficking in Brunswick County, and she was working with some of the women that were in the jail system who had been picked up for prostitution. And those women had all talked to her how they had been sold as children to pay this bill or to pay that bill, or to buy drugs for their parents or whatever. And that they were just making money the way they had been taught to make money as children.
Thank you so much, Vicki, for sharing all these different experiences that you had that showed you different ways that human trafficking could look here in North Carolina. And of course, we can't help but notice that in most of those, of course, it was parents or family members that were who are trusted with children, who are supposed to take care of children, that are the ones that are exploiting them. So thank you for sure.
And the children, because look at Shania Twain. She had no way of protecting herself. She was a 5-year-old little girl. Well, none of us had developed any kind of profile for what a familial child looks like. People just kind of, people that lived in the area where she was being sold and where she lived just kind of turned a blind eye to it. But we've got a lot of those kids out there, and I feel like they're our most vulnerable population that's being trafficked.
Thank you. Thank you, Vicki. Kiricka, tell us a little bit about what human trafficking in North Carolina looks like in your experience.
Thanks. And I think that I agree with Vicki in the sense I think that really when we're talking about what human trafficking looks like to each one of us, it really is kind of in what we see, what work we do every day. And so a big part of what we do is we do a lot of outreach training. We also provide housing services specifically. So we work a lot with youth, but we also work a lot with our domestic violence and sexual assault agencies on kind of what they're seeing and helping them be able to help victims of trafficking as well. So I will say for me, one of the things that I see a lot in North Carolina is just the intersections, because I think we talk a lot about human trafficking more in a way that it looks like it's something that's completely different, completely separate. And it's more far-fetched, and it's something that makes people feel like it's hard to understand how it happens in North Carolina. But when you look at the fact that we see domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse all the time, I think for me, that's how I see it. I see that it's oftentimes intersecting one of those issues.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you just bring up the point that it's related to these issues that we know and we understand and have known for a long time that are happening. And it shouldn't be that hard for us to understand that human trafficking has been happening for a long time too. But people
Exactly.
just can't quite wrap their brain around that part for some reason as easily.
Right.
But yes, it does intersect with so many other types of violence. So thank you for making that point. Caitlyn, tell us what it looks like to you.
Yes, and thank you also to Vicki and Kiricka for sharing your valuable experiences. For the clientele that we've served, I've noticed certain commonalities in some of the cases that we've worked on. Typically, there are situations where like administrative agencies or community services were not accessible for some reason, whether that's geographic isolation or linguistic barriers, a variety of reasons. Those agencies are not going to be accessible. Many of our clients have had negative past experiences or preconceived notions about law enforcement, whether that's coming from their experience domestically in the US or the foreign country that they're traveling from. And then the trafficker was able to manipulate a vulnerability like limited economic opportunity available to them due to geography or immigration status, developmental disabilities, age, literacy level, past involvement with the criminal justice system, where you have charges and convictions that really limit your opportunities, or experiences with substance abuse. So in my personal office, the farm worker unit, in my current case docket, so this is not reflective of all of legal aid, the overwhelming majority of cases that my office represents are foreign nationals who've been brought to North Carolina through a legal guest worker program to work in North Carolina. And then their visa is tethered to that sponsoring party. It could be an employer, it could be a family. Typically, statistically in our office, it's where it's tethered to an employer who's kind of like a labor broker or a temporary staffing agency that's furnishing labor out to other businesses. And that labor broker typically has connections to the family's hometown in the foreign country where that survivor's family resides. And that's sort of a common theme that's been running through our case docket.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you mentioned that so many of your cases, the victims that you work with are a part of the H-2A visa program, because I think there's this misconception in our culture that if a victim is from another country, that they have come here illegally. And so I think that's really, I appreciate you mentioning that even if they do everything right, if they apply for the visa and come over legally, that they're still incredibly vulnerable because of all of the reasons that you mentioned, but especially because that visa is connected to their employer. And so that means that employer just holds an unfair amount of power over that person. So thank you for mentioning that. And also that the contractor in many cases has contact with their family back home. So that certainly can be a type of coercion to use against them here.
Yeah, and sometimes that's perceived power and not always actual power, but those perceptions or sort of lack of knowledge of the laws here or sort of the circumstances happening around them can be manipulated. And I'll also say I'm sure there are plenty of healthy relationships through these temporary guest worker programs, but thank you for pointing out that really sort of unhealthy power dynamic that it can create that can be exploited in the wrong hands.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to think we've talked for a minute, for several minutes now about what human trafficking looks like. And I want us to just sort of take a step back now and think about, well, what is one action that North Carolina as a state could take that would be a game changer for addressing human trafficking in North Carolina? What is the one thing we could do that could really change human trafficking? So I'm going to start with Kiricka this time.
So it's funny that you say one thing, Pam, because I'm like, it's so many things. But I think for me, it all boils back down to the word collaboration. And I say that because one of the things that I was going to mention, I had two things, but one of them was thinking about how when we first started human trafficking work, when we got our first grant in North Carolina, NC CASA, Legal Aid of North Carolina, NC Stop, Human Trafficking, so many groups work together. And I feel like out of all the things we did, that's what we did really well. We coordinated, we collaborated, we talked across, lines, we worked together really well, but somehow our movement has kind of shifted into silos. So I do think that one of the biggest things for me would be seeing people work more collaboratively, but also I think a part of that collaboration also comes from being informed by other movements. So looking at what those successes were and the struggles also of the domestic violence movement, the sexual assault movement, what's happened with child abuse in North Carolina, how do we really use some of those things to make the work that we're doing a lot more productive. Also, so we're not sort of operating on that hamster wheel all the time, and really talking to each other, because I think that unfortunately with people focus more on funding and trying to figure out which part, where's my lane versus where's your lane, we lose a lot of the momentum that we used to have in the beginning. And for me, back when we all worked together, I loved this work. And not that I don't like the work now, but I love the way that we did it together back then. And I'd love to see us get back there.
Thank you, Kiricka. That's a word that we throw around a lot, isn't it? Collaboration. But talking about it and actually doing it are two really different things. So thank you for that. Vicki, what is one action that you think North Carolina could take that could really be a game changer? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yep. I agree with her on collaboration. We have a foundation in Guatemala, and we've had it there for 25 years, and we work a lot with the Mayans down there. And the NGOs tend to kind of fight each other for who's going to get the people. Not that there's not enough for all of us, because they want the funding from it. And so I've seen a lot of NGO fighting each other to try and because they don't want that person getting their funding and stuff. Well, the work that I do, I am lucky enough or whatever, that I have a business that makes enough money to support me that I don't have to have NGO money. And it makes it so I can collaborate with anybody because I'm not worried about taking your funding or you taking my funding or whatever, because I don't have any funding. I do think that people working together, like one of the things I've seen, probably got, I don't know, 20 different friends, NGOs that are in trafficking on my Facebook pages that I pay attention to what they're doing and where they're going with it. And I've seen in the last 10 years how we've taken the lured young adult and the lured teen and watched how they've been pulled into trafficking and the horror of their lives, and how, you know, we can recognize them, how we can develop profiles on them, how we can come up with systems that actually work for them, how we can re-educate them so they have better job possibilities and everything. And we've done really well in 10 years. I've just been really impressed with how much we've done, and it's been through education. And I see that so strongly with the familial child, because trying to develop a profile that can be taught to any caregiver in the world, you know, starting with daycare, of the familial child that's being sold for sex is difficult. And then coming up with programs that will help that familial child and keep them in a safe situation is very difficult. I'm working right now with a woman getting her PhD from UNC, and that's what she's doing it on, is trying to develop a profile for the familial child. And I'm pretty excited about it because my husband and I have been working on it for 2 or 3 years, and we have a lot of stuff put together, but this woman has all the back office that I don't have. And so she can do all that part of it, and I can just kind of help educate her. So in my book, the most important thing is educating people so that they actually believe that it happens, and they're horrified by it happening, and they want to pay attention to keeping our children safe.
Thank you, Vicki. I appreciate that. And I think, you know, as I've gotten to know you and have, our organization has sought to educate people about familial child sex trafficking. It's so hard to identify those kids.
Yeah.
They
The kids they don't identify themselves. You know,
right.
you may have a 20-year-old come in and identify themselves as being trafficked, but you don't have a 5-year-old. Mm-hmm. And if you start suspecting one, they've been so terrified and so bullied and threatened that they wouldn't tell. I would have never told. I mean, it would have taken a lot. So, but I did have signs. And I did have things. I mean, what 9-year-old knows what bestiality is and could describe it to you? So.
Yeah. Thank you, Vicki. So, Caitlyn, what do you think is the one thing that North Carolina could do?
Well, I'll echo Kiricka's sentiments that one thing is so hard to pin down. And I'll also burst everyone's bubble. As an attorney, I know what everyone's going to expect me to say, but I do work for an organization with funding restrictions that prevent me from commenting or endorsing legislative change. Looking, you know, I think we would really be served well as a movement in North Carolina. I'm going to double down on Kiricka's collaboration, but also to resist looking at the problem from like a rescue mentality. Listening to survivors about what they think will achieve justice, what they want, and not always requiring them to trade the story of their trafficking for your ear. Some things that our survivor clients had shared with us that were really important to them was having agencies and services that meet people where they are and are accessible. So sometimes you'll be doing an initial intake and the survivor is talking not necessarily about how the trafficker did this to them or that to them, but then they went to report to an agency who didn't listen to them, or they couldn't get in touch with, or who made promises that they did not fulfill. And also sort of the treating, find ways or systems to remove barriers and treat others in our community like full members of society. Sometimes we only want to accept someone for the services that they're providing to us and not as like a full member of our community. Also our clients it's been very important to them to hold bad actors accountable and bad systems that perpetuate or make it easy to exploit individuals and their situation, hold those systems accountable as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlyn. I appreciate that. So yeah, that was more than one thing. That was a lot of things.
Listening.
But yeah, I think one thing that you said that resonates though is to listen to survivors and ask them what they think justice looks like. And I think that that idea is becoming more prevalent in our service provision world and in the human trafficking world, because for so many people, there's no justice unless the human trafficker is in jail for X number of years, while the victim or the survivor may simply want their own record clear and be able to get on with their life. And that's what justice is to them. It could be totally different things. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
Thank you.
So what needs to happen in North Carolina to prevent human trafficking? And I think you've gone last a couple of times, Caitlyn, so I'm letting you go first this time. What do we do to prevent human trafficking in North Carolina?
I love that you're talking about prevention. I feel like so much of anti-human trafficking awareness and services is about like rescuing someone who is in dire straits and cannot be helped by anyone else, when really some simple things could be in place to prevent that trafficking in the first place. It's something that I've said a couple of times today, but certainly removing barriers to accessing the services of agencies, including law enforcement agencies and just community resources, and funding long-term sustainable initiatives that adhere to best practices. So I know that Pam and Kiricka, I've worked with you for many years, over a decade, in this work, and it's hard to continue this work. It's not common that you have the same faces season after season that you get to work with elbow to elbow in the movement, because the funding streams are really short term. Sometimes they go to different organizations that are maybe in vogue or really good self-promoters, but are not doing the work responsibly and sustainably. And that also goes for sort of funding the law enforcement side in the same way, in a responsible, sustainable way, where people are adhering to best practices and trauma-informed techniques.
Thank you so much. I think that what you had to say about sustainability and long-term work is so important, because when we look at these grant cycles, the long ones are 2 years. And so, you spend 6 months getting started and figuring out the landscape or training your new employee that the grant funded. And you spend, a year figuring out what you really need to be doing, meeting all the right people. So then you've got like 6 months where you're actually doing anything, and then it's over. So I completely agree with you that it's a frustration that that everybody seems to really want these short-term results. And, human trafficking is just not a short-term thing.
Mhm.
And I appreciate you mentioning too the barriers and accessibility to services. And that's something that we hear over and over, and not just from folks that are not native, to the U.S., but from American citizens, that they can't get, they don't feel like they get the services that they're due, either because they can't get there. It could be something as simple as transportation, or I think you mentioned language barrier. So reducing these barriers could go a long way to preventing human trafficking. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Vicki, what do you think needs to happen to prevent human trafficking?
I think that we are way too sexualized as society, and that, and I'm basing some of this back when I first started having my memory work with the multiple perpetrators, and realizing that my father had me in groups, 7 different groups over my childhood across the United States. And so I was doing various therapies, and I liked women's support groups. And so I was going to join another women's support group. And my therapist was 2.5 hours away, because they didn't have a lot of child abuse therapists back then. And so I had a choice. I could go into this women's group, or they had a men's group that were court assigned offenders. They had all sexually abused children. And there were, I don't know, I guess the course of the year I sat in that group, there were probably 50 men that went through the group. The women's group was so angry, and I wasn't looking for anger. I was trying to tone my anger down and figuring out how in the hell I was going to forgive this asshole that was my father, sorry. And so I joined the men's group, and I sat in there for a year, and I listened to the men talk about how in this sexualized society where 9-year-olds are dressed like hookers on billboards, and all the things they have to deal with on a daily basis, because we have so much sexualized society. And I understood their perspective, and I no longer just say, damn the sex offender, castrate him, throw him in the ocean, do whatever you got to do to just get rid of him, because we've produced the sex offender in the society that we live in. And most of them had been abused sexually as children. So I think in preventing it, we have got to take the offender and the perpetrator, and we've got to heal them as well as heal the survivors and the victims. And I feel that fairly strongly. We're way far behind in trying to heal the sex offenders. We just want to make them big, bad criminals that, we just want to get rid of them. And then magically all of our sexual abuse problems are going to go away. And I think porn is a big problem. I think free access to pornography for whoever is a big problem. And the pornographers know that the best age to make a child addicted is 10, 11, and 12. And they target that age. And then those kids become addicted, just go to more and more horrible sites and start acting out behaviors. And and then we've got victims, but that child was a victim too.
Thank you, Vicki. I think you make a really good point that our society is incredibly over-sexualized, and partially due to pornography, and that really creates this idea that objectifying people is okay. So I certainly think that contributes to it. Thank you for that. And Kiricka, did you want to tell us what you think we need to do to prevent human trafficking?
Absolutely. I think that I definitely agree with some of the points that Vicki and Caitlyn raised. I think one thing is definitely trying to use more of the empowerment model and really focusing more on survivor leadership and survivor engagement and inclusion when we're doing this work. I don't think we can do it because the experts are the people who have the lived experiences. But I think the other thing that I would add to this is something that we don't talk about much that I feel like needs to be added to the conversation is really looking at how, you know, there's so many different systems of oppression that cause people to be vulnerable to trafficking. And until we start tackling systemic racism, you know, sexism, things like this, you know, looking at gender equality, until we are able to tackle some of those issues, we'll never be able to solve human trafficking. Because the simple reason to me is that when we see people are, you know, more vulnerable because they're living in poverty, because of their age, because they identify as LGBTQIA, or however it is, then when we're looking at that, then we need to figure out how do we protect people. And until we're able to kind of create some sort of protective factors and really tackle some of these systems that are oppressing people, we'll never be able to end things like domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Thank you for sharing that. So yes, definitely looking at systems of oppression is a key. And I think that's something that you and Caitlyn both touched on is when you have vulnerabilities like homelessness, that, you know, people don't think of affordable housing as being human trafficking prevention, you know,
Exactly.
or, you know, a fair
Yes.
minimum wage as being human trafficking prevention,
Yes.
or, you know, childcare, affordable childcare. And these are all human trafficking prevention.
I was nodding so much my head was going to come off.
Pam, in our business, we do 50,000 a month in Google ads for girls who are pregnant, want to place their baby for adoption. It's amazing how many girls we work with that have babies from being trafficked. 5 of my adopted grandchildren had mothers who were being trafficked. And yeah, the poverty and the homelessness, but we can target it. I mean, we spend a lot of money with our search engine marketing people trying to target the population. I mean, one thing, has anybody looked at all of a sudden this whole population of people no longer have the child tax credit? They had it last month and they had it for 6 months, but now they don't have it. We're looking at it because we're going, okay, let's up our advertising for our homeless shelter people and domestic violence, because we target all those people in order to get girls who want to place their baby for adoption. And, you know, it'd be nice if we started targeting it into the human trafficking world and go, okay, we're going to have more homeless people now. We're going to have more vulnerable children because this tax credit is gone for what, at least 6 months. And these people have been depending on it. And we're getting calls now. We're getting calls of girls who have multiple children who are wanting to place their baby for adoption because they're no longer getting that, and they won't have their place to live. So, you know, if we put more business techniques to it, to try and pilfer them out, maybe we get further.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Melinda to join us for a moment and tell us what is she hearing from our audience.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I cannot see you.
That's okay.
I lost your audio. I can see you now.
Yes.
And I can hear you.
So I want to thank everybody for bearing with us on these technical issues with Zoom. But we do have so many comments in the YouTube chat feature saying thank you so much to Vicki for sharing her insight, as well as everybody else on the panel. And I feel like this is being received very well. So I want to thank you for your time as well today, everybody on the panel. It seems to be going well. We do have one question in the comments specifically right now, and it's about debt bondage. And I would shoot that question over to Caitlyn to talk a little bit about what debt bondage looks like in North Carolina.
So I think one of the cases that our office worked on is profiled in the documentary that will be airing next week. But in cases that we've worked on, and this is not every single debt bondage case, someone may be lured to invest maybe their money or mortgage ancestral property on a false promise of opportunity, like come to North Carolina, there's going to be this great job opportunity, you're going to make all kinds of money immediately. That person then leaves the community that they're comfortable with and they know where to get help if they need to get help, and then travel to North Carolina, which and travel is not a requirement for it to be a trafficking case, but in many of our cases that does occur. And they're sort of in a new area that might be isolated, or they don't know where to go to get help. And that opportunity is a bust. And now they're in a vulnerable position. And that debt is being used to prevent them from leaving. And in some cases, require them to work against their will. So in the guest worker cases that I talked about, they're typically unlawful recruitment fees that are charged by like an agent of the employer, like come work for this company. You just have to like invest a couple $1,000s, but you're going to make way more than that, much more than that when you arrive in North Carolina. But they might bring them in well before the season begins. They now have to front all the travel costs. And when they arrive, the work isn't really there. And you've got to pay money for food and to survive. And you can't leave until you pay off your debts. And by the way, if you leave, I have a requirement to report your abandonment to the US government. And sometimes the control ramps up from there. So that's a fact pattern that we've seen in some of our cases, but you have no requirement to cross an international border. You can actually be held in debt bondage in your own community.
Thank you, Caitlyn. Do you have another question, Melinda?
I do not have any questions, but there are no questions in the comments, but I do have a question. Why, and this is for the whole panel, why do you do this work? Because it's not easy. I guess whoever wants to start first can start first.
Well, I'll go first because my answer is real easy. Is part of my healing. Every time I do something like this that I feel like may help another child not to have to go through it, is part of my healing. I don't understand exactly how, but I just know it is.
Thank you, Vicki. Caitlyn, you want to go next?
Sure. I get fulfillment as a civil legal services attorney in this movement because our work is driven by our plaintiff clients who are of all ages and from all over the world, including North Carolina. And I get to assist them to achieve their goals or remove barriers to justice, whatever that means to them. And so it could be something really small. In client-driven work, sometimes it's just having a confidential conversation with someone and letting them know about their options, and then respecting that confidentiality when they make a decision that's right for them at that moment, that they don't want to take advantage of those services. That is client-driven work, and that is a success, and you fulfilled your promise. But sometimes it's a lot bigger, like a settlement that helps a client change a business practice to help something from happening in the future, or hold someone accountable, or a judgment that prevents a trafficker from exploiting people in the future. And I also get fulfillment from working with really great, creative, talented, dedicated colleagues at Legal Aid, but also in the North Carolina nonprofit legal services community. We all work together to serve our clients in North Carolina, and it's very fulfilling work.
Thank you, Caitlyn. We are glad you're a part of it. And Kiricka.
Yeah, I guess I feel like I do the work for a lot of reasons. One, for me in particular, being from a marginalized community myself and also a rural community, I saw where a lot of people, you know, at any given moment, we know that in the US, there's over 64,000 missing Black women and girls. And my thing is, I want to make sure that they have someone in this work who also looks like them to understand that we do care and that they do matter. And so I think that's a large part of why I do the work, in addition to the fact that I did work for many years in mental health, developmental disabilities, and substance abuse. And I saw a lot of people who, in hindsight, I know that that was a lot of human trafficking that was happening with some of those particular cases, but I didn't know. But as Maya Angelou always said was, you know, when we know better, we do better, right? And so now, because I know better, I'm determined to not only do better, but teach others to do better.
Kiricka, I'm really interested in the marginalized community. My adopted children are Black and biracial, and I've read a lot about it. And one of my adopted daughters' IQ is around 80, and Emmy, I mean, just everything that she went to just showed her that her best bet on progressing in life was to be sexualized, because she's very pretty. And it was really hard to talk her out of that. You know, it was really hard to talk to her about how much more there was of her than that. And part of that is the propaganda out there.
Yeah,
So
I definitely understand that, Vicki.
Thank you, Kiricka, for those wise words. And Vicki, that's interesting that was the experience that your daughter had. Unfortunately, I think we could talk a lot longer today, but our time is coming to a close. And I just want to thank the three of you so much for giving your time today to be a part of this panel, for giving your time to be a part of the documentary. I want to thank everyone who has joined us here and has, you know, just experienced hearing what you wise women have to say about this issue. This discussion has been recorded for those of you that are watching. And so if you have any friends or colleagues that you think might be interested, hope that you'll share that link with them. The link is on YouTube. And we hope that this might have piqued your interest and that you might be interested in seeing the documentary, Human Trafficking in North Carolina. The purpose of that documentary is to educate as many people as we can about human trafficking in North Carolina. So we hope that you'll invite your friends to view it as well. It's going to be available on YouTube, just like this event has been. And I think Melinda's going to put the link to register for the documentary screening in the comments so that you can click on it. And I hope that you'll share that with your friends, your family, your colleagues. We're hoping that this discussion that we're having today and the documentary screening next week will bring us one step closer to a state free of human trafficking. Thank you for being here with us. Vicki, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. You know, Pam, we have this house now, and we're redoing it. And
wait, Vicki, hang on. We're still live streaming.
Oh, I don't want to live.
So hang on, let's get that